Thank you. Just temporarily. Hi, everybody. I think we've given the stragglers enough time, so we'll kick things off. My name's Matt Ward. I'm one of the publishers at Uro Publications, which is the publisher of Kerb. We're also the owner of the bookshop across the other side of the courtyard here, where you can, of course, purchase a copy of the journal tonight at a discount. Welcome to Wild, Design for a World Beyond Control. Before we begin, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which Collingwood Yards is situated. That is, of course, the Wurundjeri people of the Woiwurrung language group. I'd also like to extend my respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to thank Shannon and Composite for hosting us again this evening. It's a pleasure to be back. And of course, the NGV for bringing this evening's event into their Melbourne Design Week programming and their Melbourne Art Book Fair programming. I think we mentioned this earlier, but the event tonight is being streamed, so if you're up the front of the stage, you're probably being captured by the cameras. Otherwise, you're all good. So just keep that in mind. No nerdy runs. Tonight, of course, is effectively the launch event for Kerb 29, which did come out quite a few months ago now, about 4 or 5 months ago now, in fact. So it's a little bit belated, but it's been a pleasure for us to publish Kerb. One of the reasons why is we find it consistently kind of presages ideas and landscape and urbanism that very quickly find their way into the mainstream discourse. I've seen it happen several times over the last few years since we started publishing the journal. It's been a kind of proving ground for a number of very influential local landscape architecture practitioners and commentators over the sort of past 3 decades since it was originally published. And certainly the content for us, we find to be incredibly exciting. Every year it comes out, it's a fantastic mix of some of the leaders really in the discourse around landscape architecture, ecology, and urbanism, not just here, but also internationally. So it's been a real pleasure to publish it, and I'd certainly encourage you to grab a copy tonight if you haven't already read it. All of that aside, I'm going to hand over now to Stephen, who's our chair for this evening.
I'm Stephen Reid, as you probably have just worked out. At least you've worked out my name's Stephen, because sorry about that. So I'd like to introduce these guys, but before I do, I also just want to mention that this is a journal that is produced primarily by RMIT landscape architecture students, and it's something that's been happening now for 30 years. And Liam will talk a little bit more about that, but I just think it's very unique to have a journal like this even in the entire world, let alone Australia. So we just keep that in mind when you look at some of these images up here and just think about the content of our little journal that we're very, very proud of at RMIT. So I'm just going to run down. They did a very good job. They've actually sat in order that I've got written down here. So they've been very well behaved. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Wendy Steele. Wendy is a professor in sustainability and urban planning at RMIT. Wendy's research focuses on cities in climate change, which I think is probably pretty apt at the moment. Then we have Alistair Kirkpatrick. Alistair is co-founder of ACAS Landscape Architecture. He's worked in the landscape discipline for 20 years in the field of academia, design and ecology. We then have Jordan Lacey here, which is a senior research fellow in the School of Design at RMIT. Jordan explores the interface between urban design and sonic arts. And then we have right here is a fellow editor of Kerb 29, which is this issue, Liam Finaughty. I'm saying that on purpose because he was jokingly to say that's how he pronounces his last name. So it's not Finaughty, it's...
Fantasy.
Fantasy. So let's go down the list again, and we'll start with Wendy. And just introduce your practice, what you do, and perhaps talk a little bit about your article and what does the idea of wild mean to you?
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you here tonight. So I work at the interface between the humanities and the social sciences. I'm in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies and the Centre for Urban Research. My background was in philosophy and literature in my undergrad degree, and then my PhD was in urban studies. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which cities and urban regions are experienced, the way they're lived, the way they're constructed, and the ways in which we need to reframe and reimagine the cities that we have at the moment so that they can be far more sustainable than they clearly are at the moment. So the work that I do focuses, as Stephen said, on the idea of wild cities in climate change, as well as a focus on quiet activism at the local scale, particularly in relation to climate action. So what does wild mean to me? I mean, I've been tussling with this idea, particularly how it relates to cities. I mean, at first blush, you might think, well, what an oxymoron. You know, wild and cities were sort of, posing civilization and everything that modernity tried to push in terms of, the other, getting rid of the other, getting rid of the wild, creating this sort of, iconic tomb, if you like, to humans as the most dominant species. But in the 21st century, we're realising that we haven't achieved this sort of wonderful, miraculous, nirvana of urbanism. What we've actually created is incredible destruction. We've created cities that are increasingly unsustainable, and as the recent IPCC report has clearly articulated in no uncertain terms, in gut-wrenching and really heartbreaking ways, we are creating destruction and havoc at a speed, a scale, a pace that we have never witnessed in Earth's history. And even trying to wrap our minds around those kinds of things, I find it really hard to even comprehend the level of destruction that we have created collectively as a species. So what can we do to change that? If we're so civilised, why have we created mass extinctions? Why have we created places and spaces where even to this moment we are sitting on unceded Indigenous land that is still not being recognised? We don't have treaties, we haven't got proper reconciliation. All of these things cause us to rethink profoundly what we're doing. So I'm going to hand over to our other speakers, but what I'd like to come back to is the ways in which we can take this word wild with all of its negative connotations, but also all of the ways in which it imbues creativity, power, community, and rethink the way we imagine wild cities moving into the future.
Thank you, Wendy. I'd also just like to suggest that if you have any questions, we won't worry about waiting to the end. Just throw that hand up in the air and I'll see you, and we can ask questions throughout. So if Wendy has just said something that you need to clarify, if you want a little bit more information, by all means stop me or try to catch my eye and we can ask questions throughout. So now we move to Alistair. Same question to you. So what do you work with in your practice? Are you doing a show garden at the flower show this year? You poor thing. Crazy boy. So you can tell us a little bit about that if you like, or also just what you do at ACCUS. And also, what does the idea of wild mean to you?
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen. I suppose the idea of wild for me, being a plants person and a plants enthusiast my whole life, is this idea of growth and the idea of self-perpetuating growth. And in urban environments, we see control kind of meted against vegetation. And, you have common reflections upon vegetation as being overgrown or overwhelming or threatening. And the kind of bizarre thing is that in the kind of climate emergency that we're facing now, vegetation is the key thing that can actually help us with the most low-tech kind of solution to the crisis that we're finding ourselves in. And there's this whole raft of species that are desperately wanting to grow in our urban environments, and we invest millions of dollars and millions of hours of time to destroy these plants that are actually trying to help us. So I find that as a landscape architect, as someone who teaches a lot and writes a lot, very kind of my passion. And the article that I had in Kerb that I co-wrote with Brent Green from RMIT was kind of framing this idea of weeds through the lens of queer ecology, queer theory. So this idea that this kind of novel ecology could be seen as the idea of other, and especially in the Australian context, weeds are seen as a moral issue. And I think there are definitely moments in the landscape and in time where they are, if they're next to a threatened ecology. But in an urban environment, they could actually be our best friends.
And what are you building at the moment across at Carlton Gardens?
Oh, yeah, well, they invited us back, which surprised me. So we thought, okay, if they're going to have us back, we're going to really push the envelope. So we've designed a dilapidated house that's on a 45-degree angle, sinking into a pool of polluted water, and with a big neon sign on the top of it that says "Coming soon." We didn't think that they'd go for that, but they did.
Now, I know you. I spoke to you about this a couple of years ago, and I know you designed it a few years ago. Isn't it interesting how, you know, there's lots of houses that probably look like that right at the moment up in northern New South Wales and Queensland?
Yeah, quite timely, not intentional. But I think the key message what we were trying to convey was that COVID was a great distractor, you know, and obviously COVID was a global emergency and issue, but the climate emergency is a far bigger one, and we've got to keep our eye on that prize.
Absolutely. And Jordan, same question to you, a little bit about your practice, particularly in the area of sort of the sound and the sonic, and also, again, what does wild mean to you?
Thank you, Stephen. So my practice primarily is in sound art field recordings in natural spaces, and I take a variety of techniques such as hydrophones, and contact microphones and ambisonic microphones to try and render interesting sonic images of the wilderness and then bring them back into the urban, particularly in public spaces, to create new experiential sites, if you like. It's sort of tied up pretty strongly with biophilic design, or biophilic sound design. So I have an installation at the moment at RMIT University called Sonic Gathering Place, if you're interested to see that in situ. So
whereabouts is that? I tried to find it today.
A few people say it's the alumni courtyard, you know, the old Melbourne jail. Yeah. So for me, my feelings of the term wild are shaped by my experiences in wilderness, and I know wilderness and nature are contentious terms, particularly in a room full of landscape architects. But I always have a sense of being outside of myself when I'm in wilderness areas. When I'm in the city, I see my own reflection looking back at me, you know, the modernist creations or the creations of our cities that grow out of our own conceptualisations or beliefs or ideas about ourselves. But when I'm in wilderness or nature, I'm suddenly outside of that, and that's where the possibility of experiencing the wild can exist, insofar as the wild as being something mysterious or unknown, some sort of intensity or force that can affect you in a moment unexpectedly, and then that comes to drive the creative decision-making processes, which then come back into the city. So my practice is very much about the possibilities of bringing the wild into the urban.
Thank you very much. Now, Liam, you're one of the editors of Kerb 29, along with myself, and we've got Fiona, and Leo's just arrived. I don't know whether there's anyone else in the room. So there's those of you who are wanting to ask questions about Kerb, we have plenty of people here can answer questions about the actual magazine. But Liam, so let us know a little bit about yourself. So you've just graduated from the Bachelor of Landscape Architecture?
Yep. So I'm a former RMIT landscape architecture student. and was on the Kerb editorial team last year. And so, yeah, I think when we sort of started putting our minds together and thinking what might be sort of, some issues that we thought were important and relevant in landscape architecture, wild sort of came to that forefront. And for me, it's the ambiguity of the term and the way that it can be this. It can be, you know, in the past maybe seen as in that binary way of like control and wild or civilised and wild. But then I think the more the interesting and the possibilities in the term is when we start deconstructing it and start looking into all these expressions that wild can sort of encompass, and they just cover this gamut of expressions that then can be sort of overlaid and put onto how we think about landscape as well. So.
Was there anything like we chose wild opposed to wilderness, opposed to rewilding? We chose it quite specifically because we wanted to give these guys as much room to interpret wild as we possibly could. But my question to you is was there anything that surprised you when you're reading through all of, even the ones that didn't make it to the journal? Was there anything that surprised you?
Not really, but I think it was what was interesting was the variety. Like there were contributors that were touching on wilderness and the wilderness movement and national parks movement, and how that concept of wild sort of informed a lot of thinking and the way that sort of movement started. But then there's rewilding. There was sort of like the yeah. Oh, was it? Yeah, but then there was also a lot of that introspective stuff where people were really thinking about what sort of works, how do we work in controlling the landscape, and what's the opposite of that, and how do those two sort of boundaries blur, where it can be maybe like a controlled wild or all these.
And there was sort of every extreme from looking at the DMZ in South Korea,
North Korea,
and North Korea, and all the way down to Gerard, who was basically just looking at his own wild body and how it related to the landscape. So everything from very personal, very small scale to massive scale. So you can find almost everything in that book. If you want to look at people's hairy chests, it's in there as well. So look, thank you very much, guys, for that. And any questions for the moment? Anyone have an idea of wild that we haven't spoken about? Go for it.
Okay, so I'm Tim Edensaw from Manchester Metropolitan University, a visiting scholar at Melbourne Geography Department. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about stone in Melbourne, and one of the chapters is about Newman College, the famous Walter Burley Griffith building. And what I want to say is, by using that as an example, is that I think that the urban is entirely and utterly and inevitably all the time saturated by the wild. And the reason is that Newman College, like everything else, but Newman College especially, because it's not very well built or it's not built out of very good stone, it's continuously falling apart. And the only thing that stops it falling apart is endless repair and maintenance. I mean, if we think about the city is something that we endlessly maintain. This room, our homes, our streets, every single bit of it, the parks, are endlessly maintained. And if we didn't endlessly and neurotically keep everything to this kind of state of upkeep, the wild would be there, and it lurks everywhere.
And I think that's kind of what we're trying to uncover with this is where that boundary should be. How should we actually be ripping the weeds out? Should we, we just do these things because of habit and fetish, which we'll get to in a second as well. So just getting back to Wendy for a moment. So the very first line in your article is, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's basically talking about wild city in the 21st century. So what does that mean to everyone? What does a wild city mean? Is it crumbling, allowing stonework to crumble, or is there something else more to it than that with a wild city?
Thank you. And I really like that lurking idea, the wild lurking around us. If we think of cities shaping us and we shape them, when Thoreau talked about in wildness is the preservation of the world, many people misquote that as being in wilderness is the preservation of the world, and it's been endlessly misquoted. But he actually was talking about in wildness. His idea of wildness was actually linked to quite liberal notions of freedom, which has been critiqued as well now in this sort of contemporary sense. But words like freedom and wild have so many different ways that they can be taken up, both progressively and very in very mean-spirited and uncaring ways. And so I think what we're grappling with in the 21st century is we move beyond binaries of wild versus civilised, of human versus non-human. We're having to grapple with these tensions that then emerge in multiple ways, like rhizomic ways popping up in all kinds of different directions. And that really scares people because it's messy. So how do we engage meaningfully with the messiness of what we've created with our contemporary cities? What does that mean in terms of really thinking fundamentally about some of the ways in which we've constructed this notion of the city? And I think unpacking that is essential to addressing things like the climate emergency, because we can sort of throw stones or throw money or resources at specific projects, but unless we look a little bit deeper at the ways in which we're framing and understanding the environments, the natural settings, the artificial settings, and the ways in which they are intimately entangled and interrelated, then it won't make any difference whatsoever. It'll just be these one-off projects that don't change the fundamental trajectory of unsustainability that we honestly are finding ourselves in. But we have hope, we have space, but we're kind of muddling around at the moment. Where this is the generation that are going to make a difference or not. I think we're hearing very clearly at multiple scales, from the local to the international.
And you speak about sort of habit and even fetishizing perhaps the neatness of the cities. Is that something that we need to break? And this could be a question for you as well, Alistair, is that idea of breaking those habits of what we think a city should be. And I'll give a little example of me. Recently I was standing next to a client in Collingwood, just up the road here, and we were looking at the same view. We were looking at a median strip that the council hadn't gotten around to mowing. What I was seeing was a embryonic novel ecology, full of bees, full of flowers, it was weedy, but it wasn't a native in sight, but it was all beautiful. What my client saw was neglect, and she actually sighed and said that she's got the worst council in the world. And she said that over just a bit of lawn that hadn't been mown for a while. So how do we break that? And obviously, Alistair, you're thinking probably like I would be if you're looking at that landscape, that there's probably nothing wrong with that in the middle of Collingwood. So I'll throw to Alistair first, but maybe you want to come back in a moment, Wendy, and just talk about that dichotomy of our habits and what we think is right and proper in our cities. So go for it, Alistair. What are your thoughts? And bring in this idea of the ecological binary for me as well, and the idea of queer ecology and queer theory as well for me.
Well, it's interesting that you actually raised that example of a nature strip that was unmown, because that's what I attempted to research in my master's dissertation, and thinking about what can we actually do as landscape architects. And the master's dissertation was actually looking at framing devices, because when you have a suburban street or an urban street like in Collingwood, it looks like a civic disgrace. It looks like people aren't actually taking care. Whereas if you go to the Dandenongs and you have a dirt road that's full of exotic weeds like forget-me-nots and buttercups, people will drive up there in the weekend and go, isn't that beautiful, and take a photo for Instagram in front of it. It's the same kind of makeup of exotic plants. It's the same situation, but the framing device is different.
And if anything, the ones in the city are doing less damage than the ones up in the Dandenongs.
100%. And it's like you noticed and observed that it was buzzing with insect life, because one of the kind of key concerning things that is happening with this kind of environmental disaster is the collapse of insect species globally. And I think we've gone beyond the binary, like you were talking about, Wendy. Like, and this is what Brent and I were discussing, is that in an attempt to be sustainable and a really positive attempt, there's been this huge push that it has to be always Australian native plants that are planted in any new project. And we were using the reservoir level crossing removal as an example. But of course, you know, to make this economically viable, the majority of those natives are actually cultivars made in a laboratory that produce no pollen, and they're not actually, you could argue they're not even native plants at all because they're human creations through tissue culture.
Just as a little sort of another experience, I once had a client say to me that she didn't like azaleas because she wasn't into natives. So people don't even know what natives are.
No.
So it's like, well, okay, they're not native to here, but maybe if you lived in China, you know, you'd understand. But this is the thing. Anything that's woody or unattractive, certain people think are native, even if they're not. So I want to bring Jordan into this conversation now and just talk about wild effectiveness for us and explain that term and how it sort of relates back to what these guys were talking about with that sort of idea of the experience of the landscape and what you attempt to do with perhaps soundscape, but in other biophilic design practice that does more than just, you know, create a lovely green space. And is there something we can do in biophilic design that can start to break down this binary that these guys are talking about? Sorry, is that a tiny bit too big of a question? Sorry.
If I can cover all of that, I'll try something.
So start with the first one, effectiveness.
I've got to answer your problems and my problems. So I'm going to sort of branch out into something that's important to me in my practice that I know is a bit of a touchy space. So I'm a white male academic, and my work finds me interacting with the Australian landscape, particularly with its sounds and listening. Deep listening is very important to me, which is it's a compositional practice, but also a very important practice for Indigenous people. Auntie Rose Miriam Ungamir, hope I have her name correct, and Vicky Cousins being two powerful proponents of it. And this is something I discuss a lot with my friend James Oliver, who's Indigenous scholar as well. So I sort of walk carefully into this area, not being an Indigenous person, but whenever I'm working in the Australian landscape, I'm very conscious that I'm working on lands that are ancient and have been peopled for tens of thousands of years. And one of the consistent themes is that there are spirits in the land, there are spirits in the sky, and there are spirits in the sea. So for me, this is not something I see as, a cultural construct or something like that. It's something that I see as real, res physica, real beings. But I cannot know or have knowledge of what that means because I don't have the cultural or the social entanglements or the initiation or awareness of ceremony or ritual or any of those things as a white European settler. However, I can say that I can feel something. I think a lot of people would say that. You can feel something special in the Australian landscape and its ancientness. So for me, an effectivity is simply an effect, or to feel that presence. The wildness for me is simply a term that acts as a placeholder for something I can't really understand. Even though I can feel something, I don't have the knowledge or the awareness to know what that feeling is. However, that doesn't mean that I can't try to interact with that feeling or that experience in some way and try to bring it back into the urban, with respect to Tim's comments before about the wildness lurking everywhere all the time anyway, which is absolutely true. So that's my take on biophilic design. I don't want biophilic design just to be another capitalist enterprise that calms people down to become better consumers and workers, but in actual fact it's something about trying to interface with these mysterious forces and intensities.
I think you've just answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway. That idea of you in your article you call it a pharmaceutical way of thinking about biophilia, where it's just making you feel better so you can buy more product or whatever that is, and it's not really allowing the person to feel that spiritual connection that you're talking about. And so I guess you're concerned, and I'm probably putting words in your mouth, but concerned that maybe biophilic design can sometimes be a little shallow. It's there to make you feel better so you go to the shops and buy some more product. It's not there to actually allow you to connect. So is that... I guess my question, just trying to link it back to these guys, is when you're looking at that, and you may not be able to answer this, but when you're looking at that deep spiritual connection, that probably everyone in this room has some sort of connection to landscape, if not country, for those of you who might be Indigenous in the room. Where do exotic plants come into that? Like the weeds that Alistair and I are talking about, would that be part of your practice, or is that something that you're sort of saying, no, it can't happen? If we're in Australia, we should use local Indigenous plants. What are your thoughts on that?
That sounds like an Alistair question to me.
Well, I'll ask him as well. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, what's the saying? A weed is just a plant out of place. Isn't that the...
And do you think they're out of place? You're going red. Do you realise that? Sorry.
I mean, I don't have a problem with weeds necessarily, no. I mean, I'm not a purist. I think that would be a bit strange.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just thinking a different way of saying it is, would you listen differently? Would it require a different way of listening?
Great question.
Possibly. I mean, I tend to just listen to what I'm situated in, and I probably wouldn't question what's there. I try to just absorb that and then respond to it in kind. I certainly wouldn't be turned off if I saw some weeds there.
You may not even know that the weeds are there.
I most likely wouldn't.
But can I just come back to you asked me about what surprised me, and one of the things about Jordan's article, which really I thought was wonderful, was that challenge that to me as a student to think about biophilic design as a way that was not just a happy, green sort of thing that would just make everyone kind of just feel good and nice about the world. It's like there's all these sorts of other feelings that we connect with in the landscape, and I thought, and that's one thing that I think is great about Kerb, is that it's like this testing bed for stuff that can really keep us on our toes. So, yeah.
I think this is actually a great example of where we want to move away from weeds versus non-weeds, etc. And maybe we need to look for a new language, a new lingua franca around, in the social sciences, what's becoming very, people are thinking a lot about are words like care, an ethic of care. How might, if we reframe the debate that we're having here about whether you should have weeds or non-weeds, if we're approaching it as an ethic of care around the spaces and places that we're listening deeply to, that we recognise we have different types of spiritual connections to, well then what would that look like? And that might be quite a different outcome to the way we framed it from modernity and into the 20th century, which was, this sort of either or. Another common, growing popular theoretical approach, and I love this panel because we've all got coming from different disciplines, and I think that that's really enriching, and we need to have much more interdisciplinary natured conversations, but is the idea of dirt theory and thinking, even if we go beyond, weeds or non-weeds to dirt and what that means and what how can we all embrace that commonality, that common ground, and move forward from there as a way of enriching, supporting, creating flourishing communities that are human and non-human, that can coexist through an ethic of care. I think it's reframing wild cities in these ways that are really going to make a difference.
And I also think that from my point of view, I've been designing plantscapes for 30 years, and I find that people have that spiritual connection to a certain type of plant. It might be an exotic plant, it might be a native plant, and if as a designer I try to go against that, they won't enjoy that space. And I design for residential gardens, so I'm only designing for 1 or 2 people at a time. But I do find that I sort of think, well, who am I to say to them they must have native, they must have political natives, or they must have whatever. It's like if you connect with a certain, and people do, I think, connect, depending on where they are on their journey of connection, I think people do connect with plants. Sorry, we've lost our slideshow. Perhaps where they come from, where they grew up. I have a client at the moment who has just moved back to Australia, or about to move back to Australia from living overseas for the last 15 years. And their taste, I'm sort of joking in my mind about it, because their taste is very much Malvern Toorak kind of taste from about sort of pre the last drought. So where the rest of Australia's moved on and we're using much more drought-tolerant plants and much more grey, they can't stand that look. They want it all to be green and overly watered. And I'm sort of struggling with that myself. But I have to understand that if I tried to put a little bit of grey in that garden, they just wouldn't be able to connect with it. And I think everyone's on their own journey, and as professionals we need to accept that. A bit harder to design a big public space for individual journeys.
I wonder if as professionals, understanding our role moving forward as being sort of the salesperson and pitching these new ideas to our clients. So I guess being frustrated with their taste is okay, but maybe helping them understand or educating them or trying to translate new ideas, new designs to our client. Like that's the role of every designer, just to be the salesperson.
It is, but I feel that you can only push so far. So I'm always pushing my clients, pushing them to be, I try to plant matrix-style plantings that are sorry, shouldn't be about me, but I'll quickly answer it. I try to plant matrix-style plantings that are a community of plants, but some clients love it, and I'm sort of pushing them that direction, and they're doing something that really isn't thought about in Australia, with a community of plants in a garden instead of this shrub here, this shrub here, this shrub here. Sort of an apartheid approach to garden design, whereas I don't do that. I'm sort of mix everything together and see what happens. And so I push clients in that direction, but then there's other clients who go, oh, that's a bit messy. And it's like, okay, yep, I've pushed, I can't push any further. So I'll try something, and then back in my mind I think, oh, their kids will grow up in this garden, and then hopefully they will be able to be pushed a little bit further. I think sometimes if you push too hard, they push back, and then they don't have a garden at all. And I think we've got to avoid that. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, no, I still charge them. You can't not do that. Even if they hate the garden, you still charge them. Anyway, that's not enough about me. Let's move on a little bit. Now, Alistair, I want you to explain queer theory a little bit to me. So I'm sort of a proud member of the queer community, but I have no idea. Well, I struggle to understand how queer theory relates to landscape. So can you shed a bit of light on that for people who have probably got less idea than I do?
Sure, no worries. I just quickly want to say, though, I think Wendy was absolutely spot on about changing our language, the way we move away from binary. And it's it's about the earth. It's about caring for the earth, and it's about it's the right plant for the right place, like Beth Chatto said, and that also encompasses the way we spiritually understand it. But anyway, I just wanted to. I thought you were amazingly articulate, obviously. So queer theory. So I think queer theory, and everyone is welcome to correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be. But my understanding of queer theory, it was kind of a reaction to the much needed kind of radical feminist movement of the 1970s. So that when that became really, absorbed into the lexicon of academia, and the idea of the male gaze, there was like a whole kind of range of people that didn't feel like they fitted into that binary of male and female. And we see the kind of result of that nowadays, where people are non-binary. And so queer theory, has its basis in the kind of gay rights queer movement. But when we think about it as a theory that can be applicable to anything, and so it's really about the other. And so it's the accepted norm, which is the majority. So, in kind of queer culture, that's heterosexuality. And because queer people are always, going to be a minority from a numbers perspective. And so when you think about landscape, you think, what's the kind of dominant paradigm? And so within Australian landscape architectural practice, the dominant paradigm at the moment is it has to be native, and that's non-negotiable. So, all the public projects I've designed in the last 10 years as a practicing landscape architect, I have no control or choice over the plants that I put into these landscapes. It's dictated to me by the council. Even though there's just so much, published material about how we need to use performative plants that can combat urban heat island effect, plants that are hyperaccumulators of heavy metal contamination, plants that actually can cope with the alkaline soils that come about from all the concrete use in our urban centres. But that's if you even dare to mention that, you're shot down. So that's how Brent and I were framing it, as the queer is the other, but it's also the unspeakable other, the love that dare not speak its name.
And you point out in your article, and maybe you can sort of extend on this a little bit, about the idea of plants that naturalise or colonise around things like train lines, things like gutters and rock formations. They often have adaptations that are perfect for that environment, that overly built up, that overly changed environment, whereas our natives perhaps don't, or particularly the natives that we've got on that list that we are forced to use. So expand on that a little bit.
So the plants that you commonly find that we call weeds are actually disturbance ecology plants. So they're responding to the constant disturbance that you made that fantastic point, that it's this constant state of relaying roads, repairing buildings, digging things up to get to the teleco, internet cables. That disturbance privileges a certain suite of plants. And Australia has a native suite of plants, but they're short-lived, fecund annuals. So there's no way that in a kind of perpetual growth capitalist society that we're going to invest in short-lived, fecund annuals to beautify a train station. Whereas actually it would probably be a much better idea, because then they'll be self-perpetuating and wouldn't require so much external input. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I know, it sort of does. I just wanted to get a little bit further with that. And so you're wanting to say something?
I just wanted to touch, and that's where a lot of the articles sort of follow on from the next one, and even the gardening is grooming, like that sort of can follow on from that idea of like, what's important in society? Is there the show? Is how do we want to present ourselves, or how does that continue on into public landscapes?
Now we're quickly running out of time, but so I might just pause for a second if there's anyone who wants a question.
Can I just ask? So back when I was at RMIT, which was a good 7 or 8 years ago now, the big word that everyone was talking about was geomorphic design. I don't know what
Go for it, Jordan.
Well, the biophilia hypothesis was put forward by Edward A. Wilson in 1984. He was an entomologist. And bio stands for life and philia stands for love. So he said that humans had an innate love of life and lifelike things, which is a result of our tens of thousands of years of immersion in, savannas and forests and so forth. That we've only had a small slither of our life living in built-up urban spaces. So therefore we need access to nature, for want of a better word possibly, to feel good, to feel positive. And he said that they'd discover a gene that proved this, which they didn't. And the human genome project in the 1980s, it was going to change the world, but didn't, I don't think. Maybe it did. But anyway, it's become biophilic design. It's since flourished. There's this whole thing about biophilic design, which is about architectural and design responses that incorporate nature into the urban environment for well-being primarily. Yeah. Biomorphic, I think, is more, someone else might know better than me, but it's more about copying the forms of nature, I guess. Yeah.
It's like biomimicry, same sort of thing. So I want to talk a little tiny bit just before my last question about what Wendy was talking about in her article about habits and fetishes, sort of in urbanised situations, and that sort of decision-making within conditions of uncertainty and flexibility, and how our habits and fetishes might stop us from being able to do that. And I also want to open it up to the other two boys and maybe also Liam, because I think it probably links into the other and links into the idea of well, we didn't quite get to rituals with you, but I'm just sort of thinking about affectivity, and is it enough to design a space that makes us feel something, or do we need to start thinking about creating new rituals for space and place to help us to connect more deeply to those areas? But I will start with Wendy, just for the moment, about sort of opportunities to sort of break our habits so we can embrace the wild.
And I know we have one more question here as well, so we'll come back to that. Yeah. Look, in my article I do talk about an urban stray ethic. So Barbara Creed is a feminist writer, and she writes about the need for stray ethics as a way of, she's looking for ways in which we can bridge the gap between humans and non-humans, that we can look at the entanglement across species in this climate of change. And the idea of the stray is that we're all on the fringe now, that increasingly even the kind of, daughter of white privilege, which I am, even the classic, white city-centred male professional, as Jordan mentioned, climate change, the climate emergency is disrupting all of that, and we have to find new ethical moorings and anchors to navigate us through this climate of change. And we can't just, walk backwards into the storm, but we need to actually turn around and think carefully about how we're going to, collectively move forward together. So I think the buzz term for the 21st century is innovation. But innovation at whatever scale, whether it's in design or, in all sorts of realms, innovation is not ethically grounded. Not all innovation is good. Not all innovation is needed. Not all innovation is progressive. In fact, part of the reason that we're in the mess we're in is due in part because of a lot of the innovations of the 20th century and earlier. So if we try to think beyond just new frontiers, if we try to think more deeply and groundedly about how we co-create worlds that we can live in, that can exist, including, this beautiful earth that we're all part of. This is different conversations. It's wonderful to hear, these kinds of conversations being privileged in spaces like tonight. And, I'm really interested in what the other panellists are thinking and doing, as well as the people in the audience here.
So, Alistair, how just leading on from that, with queer theory and thinking about the other, how can we start sort of embracing the other? And even if we do start embracing the other, is it then the other, or is it just brought into the mainstream? But how do we embrace the other to help start to break our habits of almost colonial habits?
I'm going to say something very unacademic and potentially very unfashionable. But it's actually to do with, sorry, I know. But it's to do with fashion, you know. Like, I think this current obsession with neatness and artificial grass and squares and box balls, and that translates to public landscapes, and the idea of civic meaning excluding vegetation. If it became fashionable, like the incredible bush garden movement of the 1970s, you know, that had this ripple effect and it had a huge impact on the ecology of Australia, because the majority of Australians are urban dwellers. So it went from these kind of very sterile controlled gardens to floristically diverse gardens, which actually did have an ecological impact. So if we can make messiness, unpredictability fashionable, and we are at a wonderfully inane point in history where everyone's taking photos of their food, we actually have this possibility of actually making real change by appealing to the inanity.
And it's not about relinquishing all control. I mean, I think it's not this binary between control and no control. It's about thoughtful guidance. We need to find different ways of
I think
framing what we do.
It's managing what we do within ecological lines, really, isn't it? It's not for neatness sake, it's for ecology's sake. Now, I will get to Jordan, but there is a question over here very quickly.
Yes, my question is for Jordan and Wendy. How is it basically the same topic? How we can get more deeply spiritual connection with the land, with the dirt?
So,
Because we are so full apart. So
yeah. So this links to what I was about to ask. Thank you for that question, because it links to what I was about to ask about ritual. Is ritual necessary? And do we have to create new ritual, or do we have to adopt old ritual?
Yeah. So I think ritual is very important. What is ritual in my understanding? I think ritual is a mode of being or acting or performing within a group, within a spatial arrangement, or with a group plus objects. And it's a means of reaching the ineffable or the more than human, that which lays beyond immediate perception. So for me, ritual is something that would have been practiced everywhere on the globe at various points. I think it's something that's become less important depending on how you define and think about ritual, of course, but thinking about it as a way of connecting with the land, connecting with the earth, is a way of thinking about connecting with those spirits or those energies or those intensities or those forces or whatever you want to call them, that, in my opinion, are always there, but we can't necessarily connect with or know in an everyday context. So when I lived in Arnhem Land, I was lucky enough to see a couple of rituals or ceremonies in practice, and because I was a school teacher up there, and they just dragged me along because I had a car, primarily I think, and paint, and yeah, I saw amazing things that really shaped how I think about ritual, and it was to do with repetition and action, smoke, plants, many different things. And I always wondered what is that action causing? What connection results from that? I can't know, I can only observe and wonder. But I don't know, I think in a sense ritual is missing now, and it's potentially a radical way to think about reorganising society or action or situations to connect with that which lays beyond ourselves, our immediate selves. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do you want to respond to that quickly? Wendy? I think
I thought
he did a quite
Jordan
good
did
job. So look, I'm not going to worry about asking my last question. I think you actually already answered it anyway. I was about talking, I just wanted to touch on decolonisation for a moment, but maybe we can chat about this over at Euro, at the bookstore, because these guys hopefully will be able to stay back for another half an hour or so to chat over there. We've got some drinks and we're also launching Kerb 30. Now, is there anyone here from Kerb 30 to come and talk to us? Yes, there is. No, there isn't. So before that happens though, so I'd like to thank you guys for coming along. Everyone give them a round of applause. And hopefully you'll be available to answer other questions over at the bookstore. So those who don't know, it's sort of diagonally across from here, across the sort of, what is that, a quadrangle, whatever it's called. And it's sort of around the corner, but you'll sort of see. Now, there are a couple of other events happening. So the people who manage this space are asking us to sort of keep to our little space in front of the bookstore. So if you've got a drink or if you're wandering around, please don't move into another event, if that's okay.
In the box.
That's right. You all have to stay in the box. We're not allowed to be wild. We actually have to be very neat and tidy over there. So thank you again. And I just want to hand over for a moment to Kerb 30, who are hosting the drinks across the square there, and also just to introduce hopefully what their topic is, which I have no idea what their thematic is for this coming year. Okay, thank you very much. Another round of applause to these guys as Kerb 30 comes forward. Come over here. Unless you just want to talk about it over there, would you prefer to talk? Oh, okay. In that case, if you want to hear about Kerb 30 and their EOI and all of that sort of thing, if you want to... so keep in mind that basically anyone who has something to say within the thematic can produce an artwork, a paper. Kerb is quite open to lots of different expression. So wander over. It's a complete surprise to me what their thematic is for this year. So we'll go and find out what that is. And if you've got an idea for a contribution, have a look at, well, you can also get Kerb 29. Apparently there's a bit of a discount just for you guys who are here today. But yeah, so go over, have a look, have a chat to the Kerb 30 people, have a chat to these guys if they're going to come over and join us. Hopefully they do. And even though I'm sure this is expensive, I really want to drop this mic because Kerb 29 is over, officially over.